By the 1900s, Scotland had zero beavers. The rivers started flooding, and nobody could stop them. But in 2001, a canoeist spotted something in the River Erne that had no business being there. An animal extinct in Scotland for nearly 5 centuries, already building a dam like it had never left. Nobody knew where it came from. However, what happened next rewrote how Scotland thinks about rivers entirely. There's a concept ecologists call shifting baseline syndrome. Every generation inherits a landscape and assumes it is normal. Scots born in the 20th century saw the Tay as straight, deep, fast. Their parents saw the same. Nobody asked why, but before any of that, there were beavers. They built dams that slowed rivers, spread water sideways, and created wetlands that absorbed floods and released water through drought. Then came the hunters. Beavers were killed across Scotland for 3 things: fur, meat, and castoreum. Castoreum is a waxy secretion from a beaver's scent glands, prized across Europe for medicine and perfume. Some of the most sought-after fragrances of the era contained it. Beavers were worth more dead than alive, so they were killed until there were none left. 4 centuries passed, and the broken version became the only version anyone knew. In the late 1990s, a small group of conservationists submitted the first official application for beaver reintroduction to the Scottish government. Rejected. They submitted a second application, more detailed and with more data. Rejected again. The reasons were not bureaucratic whim. Most of the land along the River Tay is Scotland's most productive agricultural territory, flat, well-drained, and cultivated for centuries. Farming unions issued statements. Fishing estates warned that beaver dams would block Atlantic salmon migration. Landowners wrote letters. Municipal councils passed resolutions. NFU Scotland pointed out that beaver burrows were breaching ancient flood embankments and causing 6-figure losses on farms that could not absorb them. Their logic was impeccable if you looked only at what existed right now, if you did not ask how that landscape had come to be and why. But that was precisely the question nobody was asking. The beavers did not wait for the answer. May 2001, Hugh Chalmers of the Borders Forest Trust was canoeing the Lower Erne with a group of 8, a routine outing. At the confluence with the River Farg, Chalmers spotted a broad head moving through the water. Not an otter. He knew the difference. Seconds later, the animal climbed onto the bank. A flat tail. The whole group went still. Then the beaver dived and was gone. Only later did the fuller picture emerge. Several beavers had escaped from a private enclosure upstream, or had been released quietly without announcement by someone who did not want to wait for governments to act. Nobody confirmed it officially. Nobody was charged. The animals were simply out there, building, and nobody could prove exactly how they had arrived. What followed was less a wildlife story and more a slow-burning conflict. Sightings accumulated. Farmers started finding drainage systems backed up overnight. Fields that had produced crops the day before were underwater by morning. Adrian Ivory of Perthshire calculated losses of £4,000 a year, £50,000 in total. Others woke to find embankments their families had maintained for 3 generations undermined by burrows dug in a single night. Authorities announced the beavers would be trapped and removed. All of them, sent to zoos. That is when things got loud. Louise and Paul Ramsey launched a Save the Free Beavers of the Tay campaign. They gained thousands of followers within days. Field teams began their own surveys, moving along riverbanks at dawn, counting what the government insisted was not there. Scottish Natural Heritage sent trappers. They caught 1 beaver on the River Ericht near Blairgowrie and sent it to Edinburgh Zoo. The rest stayed and kept building. The first official field survey in 2012 returned a number that embarrassed everyone who had claimed the situation was under control. Not 7 animals, not 20, 39 active family groups. The removal order quietly disappeared. While the Tayside beavers were building without permission, something else was happening on the other side of the country. In May 2009, Scottish conservationists had finally obtained what they had been pushing for years: permission for the first official mammal reintroduction in British history. 16 beavers caught in Norway's Telemark region were released into Knapdale Forest in mid-Argyll. Full monitoring. A 5-year observation plan. Every consequence tracked. It was a controlled laboratory experiment. Tayside was an uncontrolled parallel universe. And it was Tayside, the accidental population, the one nobody had planned for, that provided the real-world answer to the question Knapdale was carefully asking in controlled conditions. the University of Exeter published an analysis of more than 1,000 storm events at 4 British beaver sites. Beaver dams reduce mean flood discharge by 60%. In Devon, beaver wetlands retained 24 million liters of water during heavy rainfall, equivalent to 10 Olympic swimming pools, using nothing but branches, clay, and instinct. Peak flow during storms fell by an average of 30%. The lead hydrologist reviewed the logs. Then he said only one thing. Their computer models couldn't reproduce what had happened in the field. The detail that stopped the engineers wasn't the volume, it was the resilience. A concrete dam requires inspection, a technical crew, and a budget. A beaver dam, if partly destroyed by a flood, rebuilds within days, stronger and better adapted than before. For decades, Scottish engineers had been fighting hydrology. A beaver builds with it, and that is precisely why it works. The farming unions went quiet. The fishing estates went quiet. The municipal councils that had passed resolutions went quiet. The same agency that in 2010 had sent people to trap beavers on the Erict was now issuing fines for anyone who killed one. Then came the salmon data, and here, nobody had predicted anything. Fishing estates had warned for years that the dams would block spawning runs. Scientists themselves had not ruled out the risk, it was hydraulically logical. But when researchers began counting juvenile fish in the pools behind beaver structures, they found salmon in places where none had been recorded for years. Water behind a beaver dam runs 2 to 3 degrees cooler than in open channels, exactly the temperature young salmon need. Slow, shaded, oxygen-rich pools turned out to be near perfect nurseries. The obstacle was an asset, the barrier was a nursery, but salmon was only the first surprise. At a site in Devon, where University of Exeter scientists were running a parallel study, researchers began counting frog spawn. In 2011, 10 clumps. In 2017, 681, 6 years after a single beaver family arrived. Frogs had not featured in any reintroduction plan. They were not included in the official monitoring protocols. Amphibians were deliberately excluded from the observation list. Nobody had asked what would happen to them. Nobody thought to ask. But the beaver had inadvertently reconstructed the conditions frogs need to breed: standing open water, shallow margins, undisturbed wetland edges, conditions that the managed landscape had almost entirely erased. The frogs found it. They came back. They multiplied 68 times in 6 years. The beavers were not solving the frog problem. They were not solving the salmon problem. They were not solving anything in the sense engineers mean by that word. They were simply doing what they had done for millions of years. And the system that had evolved alongside them began to restore itself, according to a logic no computer had modeled and no committee had approved. This is where the story becomes something larger than flood management. Research showed that sites with active beaver presence suffer roughly 3 times less damage from wildfires compared to equivalent sites without beavers. Emily Fairfax of the University of Minnesota, who first quantified this effect, described the mechanism simply. Trying to burn a beaver wetland is like trying to set fire to a large wet sponge. Scotland isn't burning yet, but the droughts of 2022 already showed what is coming. Beaver wetlands on the River Otter in Devon kept irrigating surrounding land and sustaining vegetation precisely when everything around them was drying out. In 2001, when Hugh Chalmers spotted that flat tail on the River Erne, nobody was thinking about wildfires in Scotland. Nobody was modeling drought resilience for a warming climate. Nobody was counting frogs. The beaver was solving problems that had not been formulated yet. In November 2016, the Scottish government announced that beavers could stay permanently. In May 2019, they received protected native species status, the same legal protection as bats, otters, and wildcats. The scale of what followed tells its own story. In 2020 alone, NatureScot carried out 68 active conflict mitigation projects across Tayside, installing flow devices, negotiating with landowners, and managing flooded boundaries. Not because the beavers had lost, because they had won, and now the landscape had to learn to live with that. Some of the loudest protesting farmers began applying for compensation schemes and support to install flow devices fitted inside beaver dams, allowing flooding to be controlled without destroying the structure. The field and the beaver could both survive. In the same region where farmers were counting losses, hotel owners were counting guests, 20% of whom had come specifically because of the beavers. Same animal, same region, entirely different accounting. By 2020, the Tayside population had grown to nearly 1,000 animals across 251 territories. Today, Scotland has around 2,000 wild beavers, appearing in catchments where nobody released them, following water into valleys that were ready for them even when the people managing those valleys were not. In February 2025, the British government announced a new licensing system for wild beaver releases across England. Wales is considering its own first projects. For decades, Scotland's answer to broken rivers was more engineering. Higher walls, deeper channels, larger retention basins, all of it fighting the water, none of it self-repairing. 1. Escaped animal changed that conversation. Not a government program, not a billion-pound infrastructure project. A beaver climbed out of the River Erne one morning in 2001 and began doing what beavers have always done. The rivers did not get better when beavers left. They got worse. 4 centuries of worse. And every generation that inherited that damage assumed it was simply how rivers were. They had no reference point left to know otherwise. Now they do. Not because humans built something new, because one animal came back and the river remembered.